All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're going to unpack a moment from history that you have probably heard, well, a million times. The feeding of the multitude in John chapter 6. But instead of just looking at the surface-level story, we're really going to dig into the historical context and witness this absolutely profound theological pivot together. Let's dive right in and see what's really going on behind the scenes of this incredible narrative.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the crowd and setting. Then we'll cover a test of faith, the multiplying of loaves and fishes, the crowd seeking an earthly king, and finally, the bread of life.
Okay, part 1. The crowd and setting.
Now, before we can even begin to understand the miracle itself, we have to ground ourselves in the reality of the first-century landscape. John explicitly notes that the Passover feast was near. And listen, that is not just a random throwaway detail. It sets the perfect thematic stage. The approaching Passover connects this exact moment directly to the history of the Exodus, right? That time when God provided manna, literal bread from heaven, for the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. So definitely keep that parallel in your mind as we move forward.
The specific dynamics at play here are just fascinating. Picture this. They're out near the sharply rising Golan Heights, across the Sea of Galilee. It's a remote, completely deserted place. And this crowd, they are following Jesus because they've seen his miraculous signs of healing. So we've got this massive mob of people, desperate for physical relief, miles away from any major food supply, right around the time they are culturally reflecting on God providing food in the wilderness. I mean, the stage is literally perfectly set.
Which leads us to Section 2, a test of faith. Because suddenly, we have a massive logistical nightmare on our hands. Thousands of hungry people are stranded out in the middle of nowhere and it's getting late. Jesus looks out at this massive crowd and turns to his disciple Philip, asking, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" Now, the sources point out something really interesting here. Jesus is using his classic pedagogical teaching style. He's not actually asking for logistical advice. In fact, the text explicitly says he already knew exactly what he was going to do. He was just using this question to test Philip's faith.
But Philip responds, well, exactly the way most of us probably would, with cold, hard math. He starts calculating using denaries, which were Roman silver coins. Philip points out that 200 denarii, which, to put that into perspective, is roughly 6 months' wages for a laborer, wouldn't even be enough to buy a single bite of bread for everyone. Philip is entirely stuck in strict earthly economics. He's looking at physical limitations and completely missing the divine resources standing right in front of him.
Enter Andrew. He chimes in because he found a young boy carrying 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, or osparia, which were likely these tiny salted fish used as a kind of relish. But crucially, notice that these were barley loaves. Historically, barley was the simple, dirt-cheap food of the poor. Honestly, it was often considered animal feed. This really highlights just how incredibly meager this offering was. Yet, Andrew brings it forward anyway, though he immediately second-guesses himself, adding, "But what are they among so many?"
Section 3. Multiplying loaves and fishes. Let's look at how this miracle actually goes down.
First up, let's talk scale. The text throws out the number 5,000, but as the sources clarify, that 5,000 only accounted for the men. If you factor in the women and children who are also there, the total crowd fed was actually significantly larger. That's enough people to fill a small stadium. This wasn't just a large dinner party, this was a vast multitude.
And yet, the execution of the miracle is shockingly orderly and calm. Jesus doesn't just wave his hands and magically make food rain from the sky in a frenzy. No, first, he has the disciples sit the crowd down in organized ranks on the green grass. It's like he's a compassionate shepherd bringing total order to chaos. Then, he takes this tiny amount of food, gives thanks to the Father, and has the disciples distribute it. The miracle just quietly happens right there in his hands as the food is broken and passed out. And the best part? Everyone ate as much as they wanted.
Then comes this fascinating little instruction. Jesus says, "Gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost." The disciples actually end up gathering 12 large baskets of leftovers from just a few initial crumbs of barley bread and fish. So the big takeaway here is the extravagant yet completely unwasteful nature of God's provision. And some sources even suggest the number 12 symbolizes the 12 tribes of Israel, showing that Jesus is providing abundantly for the whole house of Israel.
Moving to Section 4. Seeking an earthly king. So, how exactly does a massive crowd react when you miraculously provide them with an all-you-can-eat buffet in the middle of the wilderness? Well, they instantly connect the dots back to Moses. They see this miraculous bread and declare, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world," which is a direct callback to a prophecy from Deuteronomy. They definitely recognize the miraculous power. But as we're about to see, their interpretation of what that power is actually for is completely off base.
Because the crowd's immediate goal, they want to take him by force and make him a king. They are looking for an earthly political rebellion against Roman oppression, and they figure a guy who can literally conjure up food for an entire army is the perfect leader. But there's a massive disconnect here. Jesus' mission is entirely spiritual, not political. Because he has absolutely zero interest in being their earthly king on their terms, he decisively rejects the whole thing and withdraws to the mountain all by himself to pray.
Section 5. The Bread of Life.
Fast forward a bit. That night, Jesus miraculously walks on water to join his disciples, and the very next day, the crowd manages to track him down in the synagogue at Capernaum. And this transitions us directly into the ultimate theological lesson of this whole event. They find him and ask, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Interestingly, Jesus completely ignores their question. He doesn't even mention walking on water. Instead, he cuts right to the chase and exposes their true motives. He says, "You seek me because you ate of the loaves and were filled." Basically saying, you aren't looking for spiritual truth, you're just looking for another free meal.
And this brings us to the absolute core dichotomy of this entire explainer. Jesus challenges them not to labor for physical bread. That's food that perishes, right? Even miraculous food like the wilderness manna their ancestors ate. They still eventually died. Instead, he calls them to labor for spiritual bread, food which endures to everlasting life. He is desperately trying to lift their minds above their temporary physical stomachs, up to their eternal spiritual souls.
And then Jesus delivers the absolute climax of the narrative. He executes this massive pivot from providing physical bread to making this staggering claim, "I am the bread of life." He promises that whoever comes to him and believes in him will find their deepest spiritual hungers and thirsts completely and eternally satisfied. He's saying he isn't just the provider of the bread, he literally is the bread.
Let's unpack the deeper meaning here, because the language he uses next is really intense. Partaking of this bread of life requires believing in him, but Jesus uses incredibly strong, frankly shocking language for the time. He talks about giving his flesh for the life of the world and tells them they must eat his flesh and drink his blood. Now, the sources explain that this was a forceful, vivid metaphor. He wasn't talking about literal cannibalism, of course. It meant fully accepting, trusting in, and internalizing his future sacrificial death on the cross. You have to take him into your innermost being to receive everlasting life.
As you can imagine, this profound spiritual teaching was a really hard saying for the crowd, and we actually see it sift the audience right then and there. On one side, you have the disillusioned. Because Jesus refused to be their political king and stopped handing out literal food, many of his followers were offended and just walked away. But on the other side, you have the faithful. Jesus turns to his core disciples and asks if they're going to leave too. And Peter just hits the nail on the head, responding, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." The true disciples stayed, recognizing that spiritual truth was worth infinitely more than a temporary loaf of bread. Which leaves a pretty, absolutely crucial question for all of us to ponder as we wrap this up. Jesus exposed the motives of the crowd that day. So, as you go about your learning, your life, and your own faith, what are you seeking? Are you seeking the bread that perishes, just the temporary earthly fixes, the material things? Or are you seeking the bread of life, the enduring spiritual truth that actually satisfies? It is a deeply challenging question, but one that gets right to the heart of what we value most. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.